decades between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, life in what would later be called the North Penn was largely a matter of handwork. The simple, traditional tools, the deliberate, repetitive pace, and the idea of sharing the hard-working community. All this had not basically changed since the time of Christ. New inventions early in the 19th century did begin to speed the pace, even in the countryside. Most of what we used in those days was still handmade from materials found close to home. The quality of your work was something you could feel with your hands, whether it was a yoke to carry water on your shoulders, or the hand-cut shingles on your roof, such as on the Morgan House of Towamencin Township. This is where historian Abraham Harley Castle remembered his mother and sisters spinning in the 1820s. Spinning was women's work and weaving men's. A girl would spin for a decade before she got married. If she didn't marry, she remained a spinster. This flax wheel came from a Schwenkfelder family of Huebners in Worcester Township. Today, Ann Huebner can still make it recall the familiar domestic hum of endless afternoons when local houses stood alone on their farms in townships without railroad, factory, or even villages. This is the way I pass my time. A week of this made going to meeting on Sunday a pleasure. You needed a reel, too, to wind up and measure the thread and yarn. It clicked loudly to show how many cuts had been spun. Even the clocks were crafted right here in the shops of men like Jacob Hagee of Franconia or Jacob Gottschalk of Towamencin. The tick of Grandfather's clock seemed louder when there were no engines or train whistles or jet roars to drown it out. for humility was a lesson taught over and over on the Frock tour writing samples of our local German schoolmasters. Before public schools and the English language took over after 1834, they ornamented their hymns and scriptures to charm pupils into learning. 1,000 pieces of this Frock tour art have survived in our community long after most of the old schoolhouses themselves have disappeared. This is a little writing chest made for a man in New Britain. When it was new, it must have sparkled like this replica. Lovingly embellished, it had a hidden drawer that must have held the paints and feather pens themselves. Listen, little writing chest, to what I want to tell you. If anyone comes to take you away, tell them, "Let me stay here at rest. I belong to Jacob Rohr." The maker of this box signed his name John Drissel in January 1795. Doubtless, the owner was one of the many schoolmasters who made Frock tour flourish so outstandingly in our region.
Because I teach the children, and if I truly please my God, this is my highest honor, and this is my
Desire for anything at all makes all the work it costs seem small.
Although I may not please all men, if I may only please my God, this is my true desire, and this is my delight.
Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, had an admirer in our neighborhood who did his portrait in Frock tour.
And if I truly please my God, this is my highest honor, and this is my desire.
What was a fancy picture like this doing in a Franconia Mennonite home? And where did their schoolteacher, the son of a bishop, get the poem he decorated so lavishly around 1835? When I a beauteous child may meet, whom God has blessed with beauty sweet, so many thoughts then come to me. The God who from nothing at all so many beauties forth can call, oh, how much greater must he be. The impulse to Frock tour lettering and ornamentation spilled over into houses and barns as well, as on John Swartley's fine new stone farmhouse in Franconia Township, or even into a graffiti flower scratched onto the back of a church bench. The tulip was a symbol of resurrection. People spoke of death differently in those days. The letters on Katharina Kratz's show towel spell out the proverb in German, "O noble heart, think of your death." When I am dead and in my grave and all my bones are rotten, remember me when this you see, lest I should be forgotten. We won't forget Phoebe Kriebel of Toamensen. Her sampler rises far beyond the ordinary, as it portrays not just one house, but a town, almost a city, with park, garden, streets, a river, and even a ship. This comical ceramic wedding gift came to Susanna Swartley of Lyne, Lexington in 1847, when she married Jacob Aldifer of Lower Salford. And Hannah Souder, whose husband's sawmill was the beginning of Souderton, designed her own little toy to entertain visiting children. Finally, in the 1840s, we begin to have local people posing painfully for photographs, holding their heads rigidly for the time exposures necessary in those days. Often the photographer was an itinerant, hauling his laboratory with him through the countryside. Mennonites Jacob and Susanna Berkey had their daguerreotype made around 1847. In contrast, the bonnet a Philadelphia woman wore could look quite worldly. Old Mennonite Deacon William Gottschall kept the traditional plain coat with the neckcloth that was older than the cravat or tie. His wife, Magdalena Huntsberger's cap was worn not only by local Mennonites, but by women of all denominations. Maria and John Wagner of Toamenson were Lutheran. Young Dunker Abraham Harley Castle, having grown up in Toamenson Township's Morgan House, would become well known as a historian and book collector. The Quaker costume was even more distinct and recognizable. Edward Hicks shows us from memory a Bucks County Quaker farmer with broad beaver hat, long rounded coat, and old-fashioned breeches. His wife, too, kept a cap, cape, and apron as plain as that of a Mennonite or Dunker. A more urban Quaker from Montgomery County wore his plain coat for decades after it had disappeared from among his business associates of other faiths. Although black people didn't get painted into the picture as often, they were always there, often doing the hardest work, as here on a Bucks County farm. A Lower Salford story recalls a local black couple. Dr. Charles Frohnefeld gave refuge to a slave named Jim Taunton, who came from Virginia via the Underground Railroad. When the slavery question grew so hot that the fugitive slave law was passed, Jim took his wife and child on a wagon drawn by one horse and emigrated to Canada. The main local stop on the Underground Railroad was the farm of the Quaker Lukens family in Toamenson Township. Today, the house is the administration building of the Christopher Dock High School.
For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
29 miles to Philadelphia. Milestones like this remind us of the economic hub of our region even before the railroad. The farm produce on which the North Penn economy would at first be based had to get to a market. Indian trails were beaten into arteries of commercial traffic linking Philadelphia to backcountry centers like Reading and Bethlehem. Today, we call this one the Bethlehem Pike. Here and there, an old road still runs into a branch of the Perkiomen or of the Skippack. Our local farmers were still fording this stream between Culpsville and Harleysville in the 20th century. Bridges, like this one across the branch, made a tremendous difference in the ease and dependability of travel. The first covered bridge in America led traffic across the Schuylkill just above Philadelphia in 1805. The roof, meant to make the structure last longer, scared some horses. One local family remembers its horse turning around in a bridge over the Neshaminy and pulling the buggy out by the way it came in. With bridges, commercial traffic, both passenger and freight, flowed much more thickly. The Lancaster or Conestoga farm wagon evolved into the standard freight vehicle of our pre-railroad roads. In Harleysville, where an inn was built beside a turnpike, Philadelphia-bound Sassaman Wombold paused with his load of grist from a mill along the Perkiomen. This was the age of inns. Whole wagon trains carrying wheat down the Allentown Road from the countryside would stop overnight, with the drivers sleeping on the floor. There were drovers, too, men driving cattle in from the back country as far away as Ohio. Some of the inns became the centers of growing villages. Others remained surrounded by farms, like this one where the Allentown Road crosses the Branch Creek. The bridge there survived as late as the summer of 1986, but transportation officials' patience was finally giving out, and its days were numbered. The word pike is short for turnpike, which means a toll road. Travelers had to pay before the long pike would be turned or raised to let them through. Some farmers struggled over back roads rather than pay a penny for this convenience. Stagecoaches took persons north to growing country towns like Northampton county seat Easton, or Bethlehem, founded a century earlier by the Moravians along the Lehigh. In between, roads ran through almost continuous farms. Sometimes They led right through a cluster of the buildings, as here in Upper Salford, where the farm of Philip Gobble was painted by an itinerant German artist in the 1830s. The birth of Collegeville came about when farmer Abraham Hunsaker built an academy across from his new house, along the Reading Road near the famous Perkiomen Bridge. An inn-centered village like Lederock in Lower Salford had roads leading off in 6 directions. Our best view of a local pre-railroad village is a painting of Sumneytown, where the old Maxitoni Road, soon to be turnpiked, leads through a very rural landscape. At this little Pennsylvania German cultural center, in a fine house that survives today near the old inn, publisher Enos Benner printed one of our very earliest local newspapers, Der Bauernfreund, the farmer's friend. From 1800 on, our population surplus was heading west and north, out where the frontier had space for growing families and the cattle to support them. Henry Hagee of Franconia imagined this historic western migration, showing the covered wagons heading for fresh farmland, out where the buffalo roamed, and there were still deer for the Indians, who kept retreating, on beyond the Great Plains toward the Rockies, past the Great Salt Lake and the new home of the Mormons, toward the gold of California.
1847 was the year it all began. Deadly pains of hunger drove 1 million from the land.
One of America's great immigrations occurred after the potato crop failed in Ireland.
A voyage of survival across the stormy sea.
Little did our German farmers dream that this alarming wave of Irish refugees from hunger would provide the manpower to build them their railroad.
There are people dreaming of the hills of Donegal.
Germany, too, went into revolutionary upheaval in 1848. And a whole generation was frightened into listening to the advertisements of emigration brokers. Many a young German left home in these years to escape the persistent military drafts, and took the steamer from Hamburg or Bremen toward an unknown new life in peaceful Hatfield, Gwynedd, or Hilltown townships. The first post-agricultural industry of the frontier was often logging. Of course, every farm needed a woodlot for fuel or building timber, but the untilled hills north of the Lehigh were still full of good lumber in commercial quantity. Huge rafts of logs were floated down the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. Where Phoenixville was growing along the loops in the Schuylkill, and a canal had recently been dug, was a new dock called Lumberville. And over along the Delaware, just where it bent nearest to us at Point Pleasant, with a road leading westward toward the Neshaminy and Skippack, appeared another village with the same name. Wagons like this hauled logs from Point Pleasant to the sawmill of Henry Souder on the upper Skippack Creek. For a few decades, canal building fever excited local speculators, and the rivers at each end of our region got canals. But the new idea would hardly be carried out before it was surpassed by another, the railroad. Some of the first cars, in fact, drawn by horses, looked like boats on tracks. This was the celebrated Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railway. The early locomotive was little more than a steam boiler with crankshafts attached to wheels and a platform for the engineer. Yet it was the wonder of the age, and named for the Neshaminy or Wissahickon, it puffed through the countryside with a power and speed that made a Lower Salford schoolteacher wax poetic. When the giant steam was put into harness, he wrote, it seemed as if the Titans were aroused from slumber. There is no way of travel, either ancient or modern, that will compare to a locomotive. In this 19th century, a train of cars carrying several hundred passengers is a reality that cannot be denied. It was in 1857 that the North Penn's first full train was drawn through our farmscape by a locomotive prophetically named the Civilizer. We may forget that 2 tunnels had to be dug by the Irish workers, one close to Gwynedd Square near where North Wales would appear. The crew of 260 set off so many blasts in the hard rock that it reminded people of heavy artillery. The other tunnel was longer. It remains today just above Percy under what was called Landis Ridge. Here the crew was hit by an epidemic of cholera and went on strike. Severe fights broke out. The new railroad almost went bankrupt, as there was a national depression. Back on the plains of Gwynedd, the new tracks ran not far from the Jenkins farmhouse. Around it would grow a new town called Lansdale. Today the house still stands near a McDonald's as the present quarters of the Lansdale Historical Society. The only house at what would become Telford, where the train tracks crossed the Bucks County line, would be that of blacksmith Aaron Hendricks. Not far beyond, trains could now drown out the preacher in the Rock Hill Mennonite Meeting House. It was called the North Penn Railroad, or in German, the Nord-Pennsylvania Eisenbahn, because it was meant to link Philadelphia to northern Pennsylvania. Now, with the railroad, telegraph, and canal, our region was ready to do business. We were linked by modern transportation and communication to one of America's important seaports. Businessmen from Philadelphia could dash out into the countryside quickly and build cigar factories in the new railroad-stopped towns. In 1856, while the North Penn was just getting adjusted to its railroad, it had a profound shock that made news across the country. Before the signal system was completed, a dentist-turned-engineer was urging his locomotive, the Aramingo, toward the city when he suddenly saw approaching. But we'll let Eliza Folk tell the story.
My great-grandmother was Mary J. Ambler. There was a terrible accident on the railroad, and the town then had the name of Wissahickon. The accident occurred because a train coming out from Philadelphia, filled with children coming out from the city, excursion train, to have a picnic out here, ran into a regular train, and they say it was a terrible accident, that many people were burned to death, and I don't know how many were killed. And the story is that they've always made so much account of that great-grandmother was the first person on the scene to help, and she had many people brought into her home here in Ambler. And I asked my grandmother what my great-grandmother did that was so wonderful, and she said, oh, she didn't do anything but tear up her sheets and her petticoats to make bandages. Then later, the railroad wanted to change the name of the town from Wissahickon to something else. And finally, everybody agreed on the town of Ambler to honor Mary J. Ambler, who had helped so much at the time of this wreck. Now that's the story.
And now we had a string of railroad stops that became our North Penn towns. Lansdale was named for the railroad engineer, Souderton for lumber merchant Henry Souder, and Telford for a Scottish road-building genius. The North Penn linked up with a wider network of railroads leading both north and south and connecting Lansdale with Doylestown and Norristown. That was why Lansdale grew larger than the others. At Franconia Station, later Souderton, young Pennsylvania German William Huntsberger soon started up a store. We see him advertising in Dutch, saying, I rolled up my shirt sleeves and been determined business to do, and am determined to do business. In those very months of 1861, however, the same newspaper carried Kriegsberichte, news of the Civil War. President Abe Lincoln called for volunteers to subdue the Southern rebels, and a number of the North Penn's young men took up the bounty for enlisting. Many Quakers and Mennonites paid fines or substitute fees instead. A son of a Mennonite family along the Allentown Road near Lansdale, Jacob Rittenhouse, was one of the Mennonite conscientious objectors. Henry Durstein from Rock Hill was among those who avoided the draft by skedaddling, as it was called then, to Canada. Financier Michael Alderfer of Lower Salford made money by dealing in substitutes, much to his Mennonite relatives' disapproval.
We're tedding tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary empty hearts a song of home and friends we love so dear.
The surgical kit of Dr. John N. Jacobs, destined to be called the Father of Lansdale, was put to use at the famous Battle of Gettysburg. The battle itself was painted by Peter Frederick Rothermel, a resident of Linfield at the western edge of Montgomery County.
Many are the hearts looking for the right to see the dawn.
One of the local participants was Gideon Nice, longtime resident of Lower Salford. He used to tell how he'd become so thirsty in the sustained battle that he had finally drunk his own urine from his boots. Abe Lincoln was the hero of the new Republican Party and also of a local Mennonite conscientious objector named Jacob Oberholzer. When the tall president met Oberholzer in an army camp and learned that he had 12 children, he wrote an order sending Jacob back to his home near Line Lexington. With Samuel Souder of Souderton doing picket duty nearby, General Ulysses Grant finally saw his opponent, General Robert E. Lee, sign the Southern Army's surrender at Appomattox. And the war was history. The news of President Lincoln's fate came to Jacob Oberholzer on his deathbed, when a neighbor brought him a copy of Doylestown's German newspaper, the Morgenstern, edited by Jewish immigrant Moritz Loeb. Another well-known Jewish man in our locale was Martin Wetzler, the wandering dinterman or penman. Wishing God's blessing on his hosts, he often placed several Hebrew letters at the bottom of the Frock tour bookplates he made for them. The high water mark of our village culture in these years was the local brass band. This was Lansdale's. The tiny hamlet of Letteroxville had one too, swinging into action at every election. During the war, the immigrant German Binder family had arranged for farm women from Culpsville and Harleysville to sew soldiers' uniforms. Samuel Binder's growing wealth became part of the local gossip.
My mother talks about him, the one that used to light his cigars with $5 bills, Samuel Bender, and he used to arrive late at the train station, and he'd run for the train, and they'd say, "Stopp die Train, der Bender kommt." Stop the train, Bender is coming.
Isaac Clarence Culp has preserved many such local stories. Now a lumber, hay, and store village like Souder's Station, still without a bank or church, could begin to attract clothing factories. New industry like this would make many of our people change their way of life permanently. Yet most people in the North Penn at the end of the Civil War were still living down on the farm, as Abe and Amelia Ruth of New Britain Township. That was the way bachelor folk artist Henry Hagee of Franconia Township saw the picture in his painting, The Return of the Veteran. As our local soldier is lovingly welcomed by his young family, his diligent Pennsylvania Dutch wife beckons him back to his real work, tilling the fields of their father.